Greetings and welcome back to Mythic Memoirs, where we bring you the most fascinating and bone-chilling true crime stories from around the world. As always, we've scoured the archives to bring you a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat, so sit back, relax, and get ready to be transported into the dark and twisted world of true crime. The Casey Anthony trial was a legal case that captivated the nation. In 2008, 2-year-old Caylee Anthony went missing, and her mother Casey became the prime suspect in her disappearance. As the investigation into Caylee's disappearance continued, it became clear that the case was far from straightforward. The subsequent trial would be one of the most highly publicized in recent memory, with media outlets and the public alike eagerly following every twist and turn. From the prosecution's case against Casey Anthony to the defense's attempts to discredit the evidence, the trial was a roller coaster of emotions and legal maneuvering. In the following chapters, we will explore the details of the case and the trial that ensued. From the disappearance of Caylee Anthony to the controversial verdict, we will delve into the complexities of the case and examine the impact it had on the legal system and the public's perception of justice. In June 2008, Casey Anthony's 2-year-old daughter, Caylee, was reported missing by her grandmother, Cindy Anthony. Casey had told her family and friends that Caylee had been staying with a babysitter for weeks, but when Cindy Anthony finally demanded to see Caylee, Casey told her that she had been kidnapped by the babysitter. The police were immediately called and an investigation began into the disappearance of Caylee. The investigation revealed that Casey had been lying about Caylee's whereabouts and had not seen her daughter in over a month. The search for Caylee was extensive, with hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers combing through parks, woods, and other areas where she might be found. Despite the search efforts, there was no sign of Caylee, and suspicion began to fall on Casey. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and several other charges related to the disappearance of her daughter. In the following chapters, we will explore the details of the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath of one of the most notorious cases in recent memory. We will examine the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defense, and we will see how the jury ultimately came to their verdict. We will also examine the impact that the case had on the public, and the legacy that it has left in the years since. After Casey Anthony was charged with the murder of her daughter, the legal battle that followed would become one of the most controversial and highly publicized trials in American history. In this chapter, we will explore the events that led to Casey Anthony's arrest and the preparations that were made for her trial. The evidence against Casey Anthony quickly mounted as investigators uncovered inconsistencies in her story about her daughter's disappearance. She was arrested on July 16, 2008, and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. As the trial preparations began, Casey Anthony's defense team faced a daunting task. The prosecution had a strong case against her, with evidence including the discovery of her daughter's remains, forensic evidence linking her to the crime, and a history of deceptive behavior. The defense team, led by Jose Baez, began building a case that relied heavily on attacking the credibility of the prosecution's evidence and witnesses. They argued that the evidence had been mishandled and contaminated, and that the prosecution's theory of the crime did not make sense. The trial preparations were also marked by intense media attention and public scrutiny. The case became a national obsession, with many people following every detail and development. As the trial approached, tensions ran high on both sides. The prosecution sought justice for Caylee Anthony, while the defense fought for Casey's innocence. The prosecution's case against Casey Anthony was built on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Prosecutors alleged that Caylee had murdered her 2-year-old daughter, Caylee, and then attempted to cover up the crime by disposing of her body and lying to investigators. During the trial, prosecutors presented a timeline of events and argued that Caylee had intentionally killed Caylee by suffocating her with duct tape. They also presented forensic evidence, including traces of chloroform in Caylee's car and the presence of decomposing human remains in the trunk. Several witnesses were called to testify, including Caylee's friends and family members. They described Caylee's behavior in the days and weeks following Caylee's disappearance, including her failure to report her daughter missing and her apparent lack of concern for her daughter's welfare. The prosecution also called a number of experts to testify about forensic evidence and the use of chloroform. They argued that Caylee had searched for information about chloroform online and had used it to render Caylee unconscious before suffocating her. Overall, the prosecution's case was focused on convincing the jury that Caylee had intentionally killed her daughter and then tried to cover up the crime. They argued that her behavior and the forensic evidence presented during the trial provided overwhelming evidence of her guilt. After the prosecution presented their case, it was time for the defense to present theirs. The defense team, led by attorney Jose Baez, had the difficult task of disproving the prosecution's allegations that Caylee Anthony had murdered her daughter. The defense strategy was to present alternative theories and create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. They argued that Caylee had drowned accidentally in the family's pool and that Caylee had panicked and covered up the death. They also suggested that George Anthony, Caylee's father, had played a role in the cover-up. To support their case, the defense team called numerous witnesses to the stand, including forensic experts, family members, and friends. They also focused heavily on discrediting the prosecution's key witnesses, particularly George Anthony and Caylee's former friend, Cindy Anthony. One of the most controversial moments in the trial came when the defense called forensic expert Dr. Werner Spitz to testify. He suggested that Caylee's body may have been moved after her death, potentially tampering with the crime scene and calling into question the prosecution's timeline of events. Despite the defense team's efforts, many observers felt that their case was weak and lacked evidence. The prosecution had presented a strong case, and the defense's alternative theories were seen by some as grasping at straws. In the end, the defense rested their case without calling Caylee Anthony to testify. Many speculated that her testimony could have been damaging to their case, as she had already given conflicting statements about the events surrounding Caylee's disappearance. The stage was now set for the trial's dramatic conclusion, as the prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments and the jury prepared to deliberate Caylee Anthony's fate. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional appeals from both the prosecution and the defense, the jury in the Caylee Anthony trial finally reached a verdict. On July 5, 2011, the 12 jurors announced that they had found Caylee Anthony not guilty of the most serious charges against her: first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. The verdict was met with shock and outrage by many who had followed the case closely. How could a mother who had shown such apparent disregard for the life and safety of her own child be acquitted of these heinous crimes? The jury's decision came down to a lack of direct evidence linking Caylee Anthony to Caylee's death. The prosecution had relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, including Caylee's behavior in the weeks and months following Caylee's disappearance, but ultimately failed to provide concrete proof of how or when the young girl died. Despite the acquittal on the murder charges, Caylee Anthony was found guilty of 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to law enforcement. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but due to time already served and good behavior, she was released just days after the sentencing. The verdict in the Caylee Anthony trial remains a controversial and divisive issue to this day, with some arguing that justice was not served and others defending the jury's decision. But regardless of one's opinion on the outcome, there is no denying that the trial and its aftermath had a profound impact on those involved and on the public perception of the criminal justice system. The verdict in the Caylee Anthony trial may have brought an end to the legal proceedings, but the aftermath of the case would continue to reverberate throughout the country. Many people were outraged by the verdict, feeling that justice had not been served for Caylee Anthony. There were protests and calls for changes in the justice system, with some even going so far as to threaten violence against Caylee Anthony herself. Caylee Anthony, for her part, largely withdrew from the public eye after the trial. She faced significant social stigma and struggled to rebuild her life in the wake of the intense media scrutiny she had faced. Meanwhile, the legacy of the case could be felt in the way it influenced public perception of high-profile trials, and the way they are covered in the media. The Caylee Anthony trial brought to light the power of the 24-hour news cycle and the impact it can have on the legal process. Ultimately, the Caylee Anthony trial serves as a reminder of the complexities of the justice system and the challenges that come with trying to find the truth in high-profile cases. It may be impossible to ever truly know what happened to Caylee Anthony, but the case will continue to be studied and analyzed for years to come. The Caylee Anthony trial left an indelible mark on the American legal system and the public consciousness. The trial sparked nationwide debates on the criminal justice system, the role of the media in trials, and the morality of a mother's actions towards her child. Despite the controversy surrounding the verdict, the Caylee Anthony trial served as a wake-up call for the American criminal justice system. The case highlighted the importance of evidence and the need for thorough investigations before bringing charges against an individual. It also underscored the need for competent and ethical defense attorneys who are committed to upholding their clients' rights. The case also showed the power and influence of the media in shaping public opinion and the outcome of trials. The intense media scrutiny of the case, fueled by sensational headlines and 24-hour news coverage, ultimately had a significant impact on the jury's decision. Moreover, the Caylee Anthony trial brought attention to the issue of child neglect and abuse, and the importance of protecting vulnerable children from harm. It prompted increased public awareness and activism towards child welfare issues and the need for better support for at-risk families. In the end, the Caylee Anthony trial will be remembered as a complex and emotionally charged case that tested the limits of the American legal system. It serves as a reminder of the importance of due process, the need for ethical and competent legal representation, and the necessity of protecting the rights of all individuals, including the most vulnerable among us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Caylee Anthony trial. It was a case that captivated the nation and sparked intense debates about justice, the legal system, and the truth. Throughout the various chapters, we explored the disappearance of Caylee Anthony, the trial preparations, the prosecution and defense's cases, the verdict, and the aftermath. We saw how the trial brought forth intense emotions, strong opinions, and a sense of dividedness among the public. As we conclude this video, I encourage you to reflect on the legacy of the Caylee Anthony trial. What did it reveal about our society, our justice system, and our own biases and beliefs? What lessons can we learn from this case as we move forward? Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content like this. And as always, feel free to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Until next time, take care.